Welcome back, everyone. Let's end Season 1 of Controversial Games off with a bang. Here are 10 controversial NES games. I hope you enjoy. Abodox. Released for the NES in 1990, was a shoot-'em-up game that quickly became controversial for its unsettling and gruesome imagery. Set inside a gigantic alien organism, Abodox features grotesque biological enemies, from floating eyeballs to tentacle monsters and decomposing flesh walls, creating a visceral horror experience rarely seen in games of its time. The game's graphics were notably graphic, with some enemies exploding into gory chunks upon defeat, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable on a family-friendly console like the NES. This macabre art style was unlike the typical cartoonish or fantasy visuals that most NES players were accustomed to, sparking debates among parents and media critics about the game's suitability for younger audiences. Additionally, Abodox was controversial due to its eerie and disturbing atmosphere, which was amplified by its music and sound effects. The soundtrack featured unsettling, dissonant compositions that added a layer of tension and fear to the gameplay. The combination of dark, body horror-inspired visuals with a chilling soundtrack created an experience that some felt was too intense for the NES, a system often marketed toward children. The game's overall tone and aesthetic made it a divisive title among gamers, with some praising its unique style and ambitious design, while others criticized it for being overly grotesque and too disturbing for a mainstream audience. Deadly Towers, released for the NES in 1987, quickly became one of the most controversial games on the platform, but not for the reasons you might expect. Rather than dealing with mature themes or graphic content, Deadly Tower earned its notoriety through its challenging and often frustrating gameplay. The game was plagued by cryptic design choices, including maze-like dungeons, frequent enemy respawns, and punishing difficulty spikes. Players often found themselves lost in the game's vast and confusing labyrinths, with little to no guidance on how to progress. The controls were clunky, the hit detection was inconsistent, and the game's graphics were considered poor even by the standards of its time. Many critics felt that these issues made the game feel unfair and overly difficult, leading to its reputation as one of the worst NES games ever released. The controversy around Deadly Towers wasn't just about its gameplay flaws. It also sparked broader debates about quality control and consumer expectations in the gaming industry. Players who had purchased the game based on its promising fantasy adventure premise felt misled by the experience it delivered. The backlash was strong enough that Deadly Towers became a cautionary tale for game developers, demonstrating the importance of playtesting and thoughtful design. Its infamy persisted over the years, making it a prime example of how poor game design can turn a potentially great idea into a frustrating ordeal. The game's failure also fueled discussions on the need for more consistent quality standards for NES titles, as players and critics alike called for better experiences on the beloved console. River City Ransom, released for the NES in 1989, was an innovative beat-em-up game that stirred controversy for its unconventional mix of genres and atypical gameplay elements. Unlike many side-scrolling brawlers of the time, River City Ransom combined action RPG mechanics, allowing players to level up their characters by buying items, learning new moves, and exploring an open world. While this blend of gameplay styles has been praised in retrospect, at the time it confused and frustrated some players who expected a straightforward fighting game experience. The game's open-ended design and non-linear progression were ahead of their time, but these same features led to criticism from those who found the lack of guidance and structure disorienting and overly complex for the NES's target audience. Moreover, River City Ransom became a subject of controversy due to its portrayal of street violence and gang culture. The game featured high school students engaging in hand-to-hand combat across city streets, which raised concern among some parents and media outlets about its potential influence on young players. The comic-style violence, while not graphically intense, was persuasive throughout the game, with players using various weapons from chains to trash cans to defeat their enemies. Despite its cartoonish aesthetic, the setting and content of River City Ransom led to debates over whether such themes were appropriate for a family-oriented console like the NES. However, this controversy also helped to cement its reputation as a cult classic, attracting players who appreciated its bold approach to storytelling and gameplay, challenging the status quo of the video game landscape at the time. Castlevania II: Simon's Quest, released for the NES in 1988, and quickly became a controversial title among fans of the original Castlevania game due to its dramatic shifting gameplay style and design philosophy. Unlike the straightforward, linear action of its predecessor, Simon's Quest introduced RPG elements like exploration, leveling up, and an open-world map filled with cryptic puzzles and hidden paths. Many players were frustrated by the game's lack of direction and vague hints, which often required trial and error or consulting outside sources to make any real progress. The infamous day-night cycle, which abruptly halted the action and increased the difficulty of enemies after dark, also drew criticism for interrupting the gameplay flow and making an already challenging game feel more unforgiving.
Why does this need to happen so often? Like every 5 minutes? Why does it take so long? Nobody feels like sitting through this every time. How would you like it if you were playing a game and then every 5 minutes I came over and paused it, then counted 10 tedious seconds and then let you continue to play the game? Now, I mean, why did they think that that would be a good idea and interrupt the gameplay? Did they think it would be more realistic?
The controversy surrounding Castlevania II wasn't just about its complex mechanics. It was also fueled by issues with its English localization. Poorly translated dialogue led to confusion, with in-game clues often being misleading or nonsensical, causing players to struggle through the game without understanding what to do next. These flaws were so significant they became a key talking point in the gaming community, leading to debates about the importance of a clear communication in game design. Despite these issues, Simon's Quest has developed a cult following over the years, with some players appreciating its ambitious attempt to blend action with RPG elements. Yet for many, the game's unorthodox approach and frustrating design choices have cemented it as one of the most polarizing entries in the Castlevania series. Rolling Thunder, released for the NES in 1989, stirred controversy for multiple reasons, including its depiction of violence and the portrayal of villains that bore a striking resemblance to real-world extremist groups. As a side-scrolling shooter, Rolling Thunder cast players as a secret agent infiltrating enemy bases to rescue a captive ally. The game's enemy, known as the Geldra, wore hooded robes and face masks, drawing criticism for the visual similarities to the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations. These resemblances sparked debates over whether the game's content was appropriate for a younger audience and whether it unintentionally perpetuated harmful stereotypes or invoked real-world political imagery. Additionally, there were unsettling undertones in the storyline, with references that implied to the female captive Leela had been tortured or assaulted, including suggestions of rape, which many found highly inappropriate for a game on a family-oriented console like the NES. Beyond its contentious themes, Rolling Thunder was also criticized for its high difficulty level and unforgiving gameplay mechanics. With limited lives, a strict time limit, and enemies that dealt significant damage, many players found the game to be overly punishing. These elements, combined with the darker narrative implications, led to frustration and backlash from both casual gamers and critics who felt that its design and themes were too extreme for the broader NES audience. While some appreciated the challenge and arcade-style action, others argued that the game's design choices and mature, controversial elements made it a polarizing title. Despite these issues, Rolling Thunder retained a cult following among fans who admired its distinctive style and intense, albeit controversial, gameplay. Wait, are we already halfway done? Man, time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? What are your thoughts so far? Let me know in the comments below. A lot of these games were suggestions from you all. so I want to thank you for your suggestions. And before we continue, if you're liking the video, please leave a like. It helps out more than you know. Alright, enough stalling. Let's get back to the list. Smash TV, released for the NES in 1991, quickly became one of the most controversial games of its time due to its hyper-violent gameplay and provocative social commentary. The game, set in a dystopian future where contestants fight to the death on a televised game show, features relentless action with waves of enemies, exploding bodies, and a shower of pixelated blood and gore. For a console known for its family-friendly image, Smash TV pushed boundaries with its intense and graphic content, sparking concern among parents and critics who felt the game's depiction of violence was excessive. The premise of turning mass slaughter into entertainment was seen by some as a commentary on society's growing decentralization to violence, but it also drew criticism for glamorizing brutality and raising questions about the appropriateness of such themes for younger audiences. Additionally, Smash TV was controversial for its satirical take on consumer culture and media sensationalism. The game's setting, a deadly game show where contestants kill for cash and prizes, was seen as a biting critique of society's obsession with materialism and the lengths to which people would go for fame and fortune. The in-game prizes, like VCRs, toasters, and vacations, were exaggerated symbols of consumer greed, adding a layer of dark humor to the carnage. While some players appreciated the satirical edge and saw it as a clever commentary on the excess of the late 1980s and early 1990s, others were uncomfortable with the game's blending of humor and extreme violence. This mix of shocking content and social critique made Smash TV one of the most talked about and debated titles on the NES, solidifying its place in gaming history as a provocatively controversial experience. Death Race, an NES adaptation of the infamous 1976 arcade game, was shrouded in controversy from the start due to its violent premise and dark themes. The game tasked players with driving a car to run over humanoid figures that were described as gremlins or monsters, but their humanoid appearance led many to believe that players were actually running over people. The simplistic graphics of the NES version did little to dispel this notion, sparking outrage among parents and critics who felt that it promoted wanton violence. The outcry was further fueled by the game's celebratory tone, where running over these figures rewarded players with points, reinforcing the idea that it was trivializing violence and even encouraging reckless behavior. Adding to the controversy, Death Race also faced criticism for its lack of clear context or narrative to justify its violent gameplay, making it seem senseless and gratuitous to many. Unlike other games that had some sort of storyline or hero's journey, Death Race provided little explanation for why the player was committing these acts, which led to further backlash. The lack of moral framework or any redeeming qualities led to accusations that it glorified violence and desensitized players to its consequences. Despite, or perhaps because of its notoriety, Death Race became a cult hit among some gamers who were drawn to its rebellious reputation, but also it sparked a debate over the role of violence in video games, making it one of the earliest examples of a game that stirred significant public controversy. NARC, released for the NES in 1990, became a lightning rod for controversy due to its unapologetic portrayal of the war on drugs and its extreme level of violence. The game put players in the role of two narcotics officers tasked with taking down a drug syndicate, but it wasn't your typical crime-fighting game. Players were encouraged to use excessive force, wielding guns, rocket launchers, and grenades to blow up enemies who were often depicted as junkies, drug dealers, and thugs. The graphic nature of the violence, especially for an NES game, shocked many. Exploding bodies, dismemberment, and bloodshed were common sights, which led to concern among parents and advocacy groups about the game's impact on young players and its appropriateness for the platform's predominantly youthful audience. Beyond its violent content, NARC also sparked debate over its depiction of drug addiction and crime. Critics argued that the game's simplistic black and white portrayal of the drug epidemic failed to capture the complexity of the issue. instead opting for a heavy-handed, shoot-first approach that seemed to glorify police brutality. The game's "Just Say No" message was undermined by its focus on violent vigilante justice, making it appear contradictory and morally ambiguous. While some players praised NARC for its boldness and unique take on the action genre, others saw it as a troubling example of how games could trivialize real-world issues. This mix of intense violence and controversial themes ensured that NARC left a lasting impression, sparking debates that continue to this day about the role of socially conscious themes in video games. Uninvited, released for the NES in 1991, stirred controversy with its unsettling horror themes and eerie atmosphere, making it a standout among the otherwise family-friendly NES library. As a point-and-click adventure game, Uninvited placed players in a haunted mansion filled with supernatural phenomena and grisly encounters. The game's content, including ghostly apparitions, dark magic, and disturbing imagery, was a stark contrast to the more whimsical or action-oriented games of the time. The sense of dread and horror, amplified by chilling sound effects and a macabre storyline, drew criticism from some media outlets for being too intense and frightening for a younger audience. This blend of horror and gameplay mechanics was seen as pushing the boundaries of what was deemed appropriate for a console typically marketed toward children. Furthermore, Uninvited faced backlash for its depiction of occult and supernatural elements. The game delved into themes of dark magic and the occult, featuring scenes and puzzles involving mystical symbols and ghostly entities. These elements were controversial among parents and media critics who were concerned about the potential influence of such content on young gamers. The game's unsettling atmosphere and mature themes, combined with its relatively obscure gameplay mechanics, made it a polarizing title. While some players appreciated its unique approach to the adventure genre and its ability to deliver genuine scares, others felt it was out of place on the NES, contributing to debates about the suitability of horror-themed games for younger audiences.
And then it was time for Toronto to drown in the sweet sorrow of the clash at Demonhead!
Released for the NES in 1989, raised eyebrows and sparked controversy due to its unconventional narrative and strange blends of gameplay elements. The game combined platforming, shooting, and RPG mechanics in a way that was unique for its time but also bewildering to some players. It featured a non-linear story filled with bizarre characters and cryptic dialogue, an unpredictable plot twist that left many players confused. The narrative's absurdist style, ranging from encounters with talking animals to a storyline involving a doomsday device, challenged the norms of game storytelling on the NES, and some felt it was too strange or disjointed to be enjoyable. This led to a divide among players. While some appreciated the game's ambition and originality, others criticized it for being overly complex and lacking clear direction. Beyond its odd narrative, Clash at Demonhead also drew controversy for its slightly risque content, which included characters in skimpy outfits and suggested dialogue not typically found in NES titles. While relatively tame by today's standards, these elements were seen as pushing the envelope for a console aimed at a younger audience. The game's surreal tone and unconventional themes, coupled with its occasional forays into adult humor, left many parents concerned and led to some media backlash. Despite or maybe because of these controversies, Clash at Demonhead developed a cult following among players who embraced its quirky style and unconventional approach, turning it into a hidden gem that remains a topic of discussion among retro gaming enthusiasts today. The NES era was marked by an incredible diversity of games, many of which pushed boundaries and sparked debate. From graphic violence and mature themes, controversial depictions of real-world issues, these titles often challenged the norms of what was expected from a family-friendly console. While some games became lightning rods for public outcry, others simply introduced innovative mechanics that frustrated or confused players at the time. Regardless, the controversies surrounding these games are part of what made the NES such a significant platform in the history of gaming. These bold choices, whether intentional or not, contributed to the evolution of the medium, showing that video games could tackle complex subjects, push technical limits, and evoke strong reactions. As we end Season 1 of this series, it's clear that many of these games have found a second life as cult classics, appreciated for their willingness to take risks. Their controversies, once seen as flawed, are now viewed as some sign of ambition and creativity. Whether remembered for their gameplay innovations or the debates they sparked, these games have left a lasting legacy on the industry. They serve as a reminder that video games, even in their earliest forms, have always had the power to challenge, provoke, and entertain in ways that other media often cannot. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. I'm really glad you enjoyed this series. I'm having a lot of fun making it. As I mentioned before, this is just Season 1. There are tons of other games for different consoles to look at, so be sure to stay tuned for that. If you liked this video, please leave a like. It helps out more than you know. If you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming-related content. Thank you so much for watching and your support. Join me next time when we dive into controversial games for the Super Nintendo. I'll see you then.